So a friend of mine was just diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it brought up a lot of thoughts, mainly because I'm asked about this all the time. As a Guinness World Record holder for memory, a best-selling author, and all that about brain training. I've been doing this for like 30 years, and I want to do this video to dispel a bunch of myths out there and actually give some real tools that have actually helped people with memory loss and memory retention, and of course resisting Alzheimer's. So the way I see it, there's three main categories to this subject. There is prevention, correlation, and then actual reversal of symptoms or reversal of the disease. Prevention, the best things we know right now is that diet is very related to it. Alzheimer's is sometimes referred to as type 3 or 4 diabetes, which is not an actual diagnosis, but it's more of a cultural way to say that there's a big correlation between a terrible diet and Alzheimer's. The reason for this mostly breaks down to sugar and white flour. These substances in our body, problem is in nature, it doesn't occur very often. So when it's so refined as it is in white sugar or candy, junk food, or just every sort of processed food now, it feeds a lot of the bad bacteria that hurts our gut. And the reason why that's really significant is because that can actually have ramifications all the way up into the brain. And in their body's attempt to try to get rid of these problems, it can actually be one of the triggers for Alzheimer's. Body's attempt to get rid of some of the problems. So diet's really important, but you got to kind of have some moderation. I personally was vegetarian for 20 years, and I was because I grew up with a terrible diet. There's a lot of fried foods, and just I was very, very sick as a kid too. I had horrible inflammation. I've got that gene that makes it very likely for me to get inflamed and have autoimmune issues like vitiligo, if you know what that is. I became vegetarian for 20 years, but over that time, I realized it wasn't the meat that was the problem. It was the sugar and the flours. But in cutting out the meat, I learned how to cook for myself, learned how to cook from scratch. I'm a little older than some of you folks watching, so this was before there was so many processed foods for vegetarians that made them, so tasty and so good. So I learned how to cook from real vegetables, real fruits, real meats, and just cook from scratch. And after you do it with practice, it changes your life. So that is my biggest suggestion: is learn how to cook from scratch. Don't try to look at every single label for the right additive, or to try to prevent yourself from getting this particular additive or this particular preservative or this thing out of your diet. Just start good food and learn how to cook. I know it's tough. I know it can be difficult. I know it can be difficult to fit that into your schedule, but you're going to get more energy. You're going to have better sleep. You're going to have all sorts of other knock-on effects that will definitely give you more time in your day, more energy, more happiness, more everything, and that will give you the time that it takes to cook. So it is a virtuous cycle you want to get into. I'm not going to be dead horse about this. Another one of the big things that is preventative for Alzheimer's is cognitive training or brain training of some kind, especially novel brain training. And I'm going to go into novel brain training in another video, but essentially it is learning new things. So if you're taking a brain training app, anything that is a game or app-based usually is incredibly ineffective at training the brain. The reason is, once you get good at the game, your brain doesn't have to try hard anymore. That's basically it. Novel brain training is the process of learning something brand new from scratch. So learn a new skill, pick up a musical instrument, learn a language. I often say that if you're learning a new language or a new musical instrument, you might not sound that great, but your brain will thank you for it. Brain training and cutting out the sugar, cutting out the flour will make a huge difference. Now, in the area of correlation, there's a number of things that have been correlated with preventing Alzheimer's, but we don't know for sure the causational effects. And the biggest one here is lowering stress. We know that people who go through their life without the disease, or much lower risk of the disease, it's very much correlated with lowering stress in some way. And we've also seen this in a number of other studies. There's a very famous study of nuns, women who were in their golden years, who joined a nunnery. Even in some cases, they had Alzheimer's symptoms, but because they were put in a very low stress environment, it seemed to correlate with lowering the symptoms. So I'll get into that, into reversing symptoms and cognitive reserve. But lowering stress and being social, being around a group of people on a regular basis, having lots of friends, having lots of social interaction, those two things are correlated with a very low incidence of Alzheimer's, although we don't know if it's a direct causation. So in other words, like all the other things that might be making you much lower risk for having Alzheimer's might also make you the kind of person that has a lot of friends and is lower lower stress, right? So the lower stress might be the result of a whole bunch of lifestyle things that lead to lowered risk of Alzheimer's. If you just want to look at correlation, lower your stress and get a bunch of friends, get socialized, get out there and interact with people. It also is believed that in interacting with people, it challenges your brain in a way that it normally doesn't get challenged. If you think of, a lot of people think of challenging the brain like academically. You study something and then you have a test, and that does challenge the brain and challenge the memory in some way. But it seems as though, because we're social creatures, it's actually much more challenging to the brain to just have a conversation at a party. I mean, think about it for just a second. If you were to try to build a robot to do these two things, building a robot or an AI to answer a few questions on a test would be super easy compared to building a machine that could interpret body language and subtle cues and interact with several people at the same time while keeping them happy, and also giving off body language cues while also maintaining happiness and joy in your head, and all these other things that we try to do when we're doing social interaction. So it's actually a much more difficult cognitive to socialize than a lot of people will think. And the final thing is reversing or freezing of symptoms of Alzheimer's. There have been a lot of examples with people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and then been put in a very, let's say, extreme or different situation, and their symptoms either froze or they reversed. And probably the most famous one is the nun study. This was a number of years ago, but it made the cover of Time magazine. Basically, a whole convent of nuns basically gave themselves over to science, which was really surprising considering the battle at the time between religion and science, so-called battle. But these nuns really wanted to do some good in the world. They thought they could do some great success. So they had noticed over the years that women had joined the nunnery with a lot of symptoms that you would consider as Alzheimer's, forgetfulness and things like that. And then they noticed that after they took part in their regimen, which includes a lot of prayer, a lot of outdoor activities like gardening, and a lot of low stress activities as well, low stress in the body and healthy food, that these women stopped being forgetful. They stopped having these symptoms, right? So the neuroscientists started to study it, and studied it over the course of over a decade. And this was really important because it was long enough for the women to see noticeable changes over years and years and years. And they also gave permission to autopsy their brains afterwards, which gave science a tremendous amount of data. Most importantly, what we discovered was that these women still had Alzheimer's. The women who were diagnosed when they entered the nunnery went through all sorts of cognitive tests. They were clearly forgetful. They were clearly having symptoms. And then those symptoms started to go away with prayer and with good food and things like that, low stress environment. But years later, when they passed away, unfortunately, and their brains were autopsied, they found the same sort of plaques and tangles that are most closely associated with Alzheimer's. So they had Alzheimer's the whole time. Why were they not forgetful? Why did their symptoms freeze? And the belief is that the low stress environment combined with studying something that they're interested in, combined with being outdoors and eating good food, again, diet, exercise, and the low stress environment, combined with a little bit of brain training. They're studying the Bible every day. A lot of people don't realize study all the time. All that stuff combined seemed to freeze their symptoms. And this is very similar to the principle that is referred to as cognitive reserve. That is, if you train your brain now, if you study things after age 50 or 55 even, and you start learning, then your brain actually regrows different connections. There are places where there are stem cells in your brain that it can regrow parts of your brain even, and that sort of brain plasticity really kicks in, but it only seems to kick in after you do some kind of brain training on a regular basis. There was an amazing study actually in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2014 actually, if memory serves. It was about 2,000 participants, but all of them were over the age 55. And that's really important because most psychology studies or neuroscience studies involve grad students because it's easy to find grad students on a college campus. So the fact that they had all the people in this study over age 55 was absolutely incredible. And we're talking over 60, in their 70s, sometimes 80s. It's a real big mix. And they all did novel brain training. I'll get into what novel brain training is in another video. Essentially, the conclusions were pretty powerful. There was about a 50% reduction in their risk for Alzheimer's. It was absolutely so you'd cut your risk for Alzheimer's in half. Even people who had a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, had it in the family, things like that. And even people who only started brain training after age 55. It's not something they had to do their whole life in order to see this drastic reduction. So what it appears to be going on is that when your brain is stimulated and fed good food, and maybe you exercise once in a while, then it actually has has the capability to rewire itself around these damaged areas. And of course, the good food and exercise part probably means you won't damage the areas anymore or have any more damage. But even in those cases, your brain can rewire itself. And we found this with all sorts of head injuries, surgeries. People have had large portions of their brains damaged, and the brain is able to rewire itself to become fully functional. I won't say in every case. The world of neuroscience is incredibly diverse. I'm not going to make any sort of blanket statement, but I think if you look at the data, if you look at the case studies, some examples are absolutely astounding. There have been people who have lost large portions of their brain, and cognitively they perform exactly the same on tests. Other people have had a tiny injury and they're completely devastated. So there are catastrophic cases, and there's still a whole bunch we don't know about the brain. But I think it's safe to say that if you're going to make any sort of lifestyle changes, then use this as an extra reason to eat healthy, get some exercise, lower your stress, definitely, and do some kind of novel brain training. If you want to find out more memory training and memory tips, do check out my book, Brain Hacker. There's 55 different brain hacks in here, and you can also find out many more at brainhackers.com, where we have a whole community of people who are submitting brain hacks as to ways to improve your life just by changing how you think. Like and subscribe for more.